we're going to look at some of the defaults for how different elements are treated in the browser. And then we're going to look at ways of kind of like undoing those defaults or adding to those defaults. So for doing this, it's really going to be a lot more useful to use the external tab. So to do that from the web view, I just click on this little tab view, and so I can open up the developer tools. So I actually used a key shortcut for that. It's Command Option I, and that'll open up the Elements tab. So all of our elements have something called like a default display. So that's the first thing that we'll talk about. And most of our elements, like our basic elements, have a block display. And what that means is that they get their own block. So for our H1, for that header, the paragraph, it makes its own block, so it takes up the whole width of the page. And so the next content gets pushed onto the next line. That's kind of like the default for most HTML elements, except for like anchor tags, which have inline display, so you can display other information next to them because we want to add our links inside of other pieces of content. So we don't really need to change these defaults, but it's just good to be aware of them. So for example, if I go to the paragraph, you can see the default here in the user agent style sheet is displays block. If I change that, so if I said like display is inline, see how that this paragraph like takes up the whole space and it has those margins. This paragraph doesn't have the margins and it doesn't take up the whole space. So if we made all of our paragraphs like that, so I'm just going to make a rule here for all of my paragraphs. This is just for example. If I set all of my paragraphs to display in line the way the anchor tag does, now they just sit next to each other because they don't have block display anymore, so they don't separate out from each other. So we probably won't spend a lot of time changing those defaults because the defaults are kind of built in for a reason. If you have a paragraph, you usually want it to sit on its own. If you have an anchor tag, you usually want it to be inside of some other content. So the defaults for the most part are pretty good. We don't really need to play with those. So that's the display setting. We may come into some other cases where we want to change that, but for now, we'll just move on to the next part. So the next part is called the box model. And so the box model essentially gives all of our different components a couple properties. And you can see a diagram of that in the Chrome tools down here. So this is the box model right here. And the box model basically means you have your content, that's the blue section. Then you have this thing called padding, which is space in between the content and other things around it. Then you have a border, which is like a visible line or design that goes around the content. And then you have a margin that goes between the content and other things. We're going to come back to that in a second. But the defaults, you can see some of the defaults. So for the H1, you can see the default for the box model for the margins is right here. For the paragraph, it's right here. So if I added a rule, and for the paragraphs, let's say I said the margin is 0, that takes away that kind of like orange space. And so let's do just an example real quick on the H1. So if I take my H1, and right now there's no border, so we can't really tell the difference between margin and padding. But if I added a border, so if I wanted a border, I could add a border style and say solid. So that makes a little border. And then I can change stuff about the border. I can change the color. I can do other things like that. But once I have this border, it's a little bit easier to understand where everything else goes. So you can see those orange margins are outside of the border. Whereas if I put some padding in here, so if I say padding, and I say 1EM, notice that the green padding is on the inside of the border. Okay, so, and if I change my margin to 0, now I have a bunch of padding, and that looks nice. And then without the margin, there's no space between the border and the other stuff. So let's talk about what this means real quick, because you'll see that a lot. So when I highlight this H1, you can see there's this green padding, and the unit for the padding is 1EM. And that probably doesn't really mean anything, but EM is a unit of measurement that is used in printing books, and it refers to one unit of the font size. So in HTML, our default font size is 16 pixels. So 1EM is equal to 16 pixels. And so this is an easy way to do design where instead of just coming up with a random number of pixels, we can say we want it to be the size of the font or twice the size of the font. We can add to it like that. So if I change the padding from 1EM to 2EM, we double that value. So most of the time, when you see units for layout, you'll see either EM or you'll see pixels, or sometimes you'll see percentages, and we'll look at that in a little bit. Another weird thing about the box model is the way that these rules are written. So you can see when I say padding is 1EM, that's actually adding padding on the top, above the text, the bottom, the left, and the right. That's like the box. You know, we have 4 sides of a box. But we can add it to the box in different ways. So if we just give it 1 unit, it puts it on all 4 sides. We can also say specific units. So this rule is equivalent to saying padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left. But we could also say something like padding 1EM and then 0. So if we have 2 rules, the first value goes to the top and bottom, and then the second value goes to the right and left. So since the right and the left are often similar versus the top and bottom, that's just a shorthand way to do that. But we can also write all 4 out if we want to. So we can say 1EM 0, 0, 1EM, something weird like that. So you can get different values. So that's another thing with CSS is there's a lot of conventions like this where we can kind of add a bunch of rules together. It's something that you just kind of get used to after you see different rules. So you might see a rule like this. You might see a rule that says like border is 10 pixels dashed blue. And so that's actually combining 3 different border rules into one. This is something that we can do in CSS that saves us a little time, because this is the equivalent of writing like basically all of these rules. And so it kind of saves us the time of writing out every single one of these rules if we have one thing that we want to apply to the entire border, as opposed to going one at a time. So those are some rules that you'll see when you're kind of like looking around at CSS stuff. So for now, we don't really have that much to do with the margin and border, because our content is very simple. We just have some text and we have some links. But as we build our Choose Your Own Adventure story, we might want to have multiple options. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to build in a couple new options, or we're going to take our images and use those to illustrate our options. And we're going to use some layout to make that look a little bit better. So one other thing that we might want to do before we get started is when we do layout, we need to organize our content into different sections. So we have a different HTML element that allows us to do this. Right now, all of our HTML elements are just being used to display content, whether it's text or images. But a lot of HTML stuff, we need to organize it into subgroups. And there's a few different ways we can do this, but the main default one that we use is called a div, which stands for a division. And it comes from magazine layout. When you're laying out magazines, you have different divisions that have different components and different sections. So same thing, if we look at the New York Times again, you can see that we have content organized into different areas. So we have like an H and a couple paragraphs. We have an image, we have another image, another H, paragraph. And if we had these all in one big line, they would just go down the page. And we can see that the way that the New York Times and most websites organize these sections is into things called divs. There's also special divs. So we can see, if we look in here, we'll probably see some examples. So yeah, here's a special div called a section. But a lot of these guys are just divs. So if we look at like the whole site, we can see here's the body section. Then we have like the main div is called the app. So that's like the main content. Inside here, we have a whole bunch of stuff. This is a very like over-engineered website. Most websites don't look like this. But here we have something called the main section. This is just a div, but it uses main just to tell it, tell the website that it's the main section. There's also a nav section. But these main and nav and things like that are really just divs with special names. But most of these things are divs. We see we have this div here. We have a div for the smartphone. We have a div for the feed. We have the divs for the data hierarchy. There's all these divs. Finally, we get down to this section for the story wrapper. So we use all this HTML to organize our content so we can display it in columns or rows or different ways. So we're gonna do a couple examples of this on our homepage. We talked about centering the content earlier, and we used text-align to do a simple centering. But that's not really like a sophisticated way of doing it. What we really want to do is center our whole content. And so this requires the application of a few different rules. So when I'm testing something out, I'll usually go over to Chrome Inspector and try some things. But I need to add a little HTML to organize my content first. So I'm going to go back to my index page. And I'm going to put a div around all of my content. This way I can center the content, but leave the body of the page the same. So the way that I do this is I go to the body section and add a new line. And I make a new HTML element. And I just call it div. It's going to add a div here. And then I just want to go to where I want this div to end. And I'm going to close that div there. One thing that I haven't showed yet is this button here to format. This is very useful. I use this a lot. It's going to format your HTML. So for example, if I have this paragraph is over here and this one's over here and all of my stuff is in the wrong place, if I click this button, most of the time it's going to make it look better. Although it didn't get this quite right. Let's see if that fixes it. Oh, I have a typo. Okay, that's why it doesn't get that. Okay, there we go. Okay. So now I have a div around all this content. And what that allows me to do, if I refresh this page, now I have all this stuff in its own div. So I can do simple things. Like I can change the background color. If I want to change the background to a different color, now it doesn't affect the whole page. It just affects this section. So a lot of HTML is putting stuff into more and more contained divs to give them specific styles. So to give this div a style, I need to use a way to select it, because like we saw before, when I select things with my CSS, I need to reference like a tag. But one issue that I have is that if I just use a div tag, it's going to select all of my divs, and I want my divs to do different things. Actually, we didn't really see an example of that. Let's do that real quick. I'll do an A tag here. Let's say we wanted to change the color of our anchor tags. So we see we have two anchor tags. If I change the color of the anchor tag to blue, oops, that should work. Why doesn't it not work? There we go. Or let's say I want to make it orange. Notice that it applies to both my anchor tags. Oh, that doesn't look good. Let's go back to blue. Okay, so notice that that change applies to both of my anchor tags. So I have two anchor tags, but they both have this blue color now. That's because this A selector is just generic. Anything that uses the anchor tag or the link tag is going to take on that rule. So if I want to have a rule that only affects one element, that it also has a very common tag, I can use what's called an ID. An ID is a way in CSS of pointing to one specific element rather than all the elements that share a tag. So an ID is an attribute. I can put this inside of my div, and I can say ID, and I'm going to put a little quotation mark like I do with a normal attribute. And this is going to be my container div. It contains my entire website. Sometimes people call this a wrap div, like that. That might be nice because it's a shorter word, but I'm going to call it a container. Okay, so my container div, now I have something to call it. So I can select it in CSS. So I'm going to go back to CSS. And the way that I select this div now is with a hashtag. For whatever reason, hashtag is what CSS uses to reference an ID. So I say hashtag container. If I want to be very specific, I can say div and then hashtag container. And now, if I apply a rule here, it will only apply to this div. Okay, so if I go back, let's give this a color. So I'll say background is gray. I'll change this in a second, but just so we can see this. Okay, so there's our container div, and we can see it's been given a gray background. But what I actually want to do with this container is just like make it look a little bit better. And so what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to set the width. So I can set the overall width of an element. So I can say like width, and then I can give it either pixels or a percentage. With this one, I'm going to give it pixels, and I'm going to make it smaller than most websites would normally do, just for this example, because it is a very simple website. But most websites would use a larger width, maybe it's something like 960 pixels or 1200 pixels. But I'm going to make mine really small just for an example. I'm going to make it 640 pixels. Okay, so notice that now it's smaller than the size of my window. Okay, so it doesn't fill up the whole window, and it's also not centered. So it doesn't really look that good. So if I wanted to center this, what I can do is I can use an automated margin. So I can add a margin, and I can make it auto. And this is going to automatically detect how much space is left between the width of my container and the width of the window of my website. And so this gives me a little bit of responsiveness. So if the user changes the size of their website, my layout updates to match that change. So that's very useful. There's a lot more complex things we can do with this, but that's just kind of the basic thing. And we're going to continue to add a little bit to our layout with adding a few more rules. All right. We can also add some padding to this div. So I could say padding is like 1 EM. That'll add a little bit of padding there. That looks good. We might also want to get rid of the default margin on the body section. There's a default margin, but now that we're adding a little layout stuff, we don't necessarily need this, so I can set that margin to 0. So again, all these rules that I've written into Chrome will disappear the moment I refresh the page. So I just need to remember these. So I'm going to go back to my style sheet. I'm going to find my body section. I'm going to say the margin is 0. And then I'm going to go to my div container. I don't really want this gray background, so I'm going to delete that. But I do want the width. So my width is 640 pixels. And I do want my margin. So my margin is auto. Sometimes people will do 0 auto here. So 0 on the top and bottom, and then auto in the right and left. So you'll often see it written like that. And the last thing I did, what was the last thing I did? Oh, I added some padding. So I'm just going to add a nice little padding that matches the font size. Okay, so now this looks more like a slightly normal website. So the nice thing about this margin is if I do have a smaller page, it'll adjust the content to fit it. But if I have a larger page, it'll make that content nice and centered. So that's looking a little bit better. Okay, so now let's lay out our choices in a slightly more interesting way. This isn't required. You can think about different layouts that you may find appealing, but this is going to be a very typical layout, so I want to go over how I would do it. And I'm going to have to add more organization. So I'm going to have to add more divs, and I'm going to show you guys another new way to approach adding divs. Okay, so let's say we have a new section. We have our sort of like intro here, but now we have a section where we're going to give the user two choices. And let's say we want to stick these two choices next to each other. We're going to need a div so we can set that layout. Okay, so I'm going to make a new div. And I'm going to give this an ID. I'm going to call this choices. And then I'm going to put these two paragraphs in here. So I'll close that div. And it's actually formatting on save, which is nice. You don't have to save, but I have this muscle memory reflex of hitting Command S a million times whenever I'm working, because we used to have to do that. But now nothing's changed, but now we have this nice little div for our choices, and we can start to change the layout for that div. So there's a couple things that we can do here, a couple different ways that we can do layout. And the one that would be most appropriate here is a grid layout. If you're not familiar with the term grid, a grid is just an organization of content into rows and columns. And pretty much every website uses some type of grid. If we just Google grid real quick, if I can spell it correctly. So, a grid just looks like this. It's just boxes, it's rows and columns, and pretty much every layout uses grid. And you'll go into this in a lot more detail if you're a multimedia programming and design major in classes like MMP 200 or MMP 240 or other some of the MMA classes. But let's just set up a basic grid. So we're going to change the display. So remember we talked about display earlier, and there's some basic display defaults like inline and block, but there's also more complex displays. So one of those more complex displays is the grid display. And so when I change the display to grid, nothing happens quite yet, but I have to say a little bit more about what I want my grid to look like. And so I can use another rule called the grid template. And I just have two things for this. So I'm actually just going to set grid template columns. Columns are the horizontal units in a grid. And so I'm just going to set the number of columns. And so basically, I can just say how big I want my columns to be. So if I just want 2 columns, I can make them both 50%. And so now I have 2 columns. So now my 2 paragraphs that are part of my grid are sitting next to each other because I have 2 columns. If I want to make my grid have more than 2 columns, I can do that. But if I try to add another 50%, that doesn't make any sense, right? I don't have 150%. So a better unit to use for this is called a fractional unit. That basically means it just divides up how much space there is and then adds it to each unit. So the way I can do this is with a 1FR, 1FR. So I get the same result, but what that really means is that however many units there are in total, we're going to divide that across the space. So for example, if I wanted for some reason for my second column to take up twice as much space, I just change that to 2FR. If I want like a blank column in the middle for some reason, I just add, I need to, blank column on the end in this case, I'd have to add another paragraph to do that. But if I want more columns, I can add another one, or I could do 2FR at the end if I wanted to make it smaller for some reason. I could add a little margin in the front, like if I wanted to just have a tiny 10 pixel margin here, I could do that. But most of the time, I'm just going to divide it up into the number of choices that I expect to have here. So if you expect to have 2 choices, then you probably want 2 columns. If you expect to have more choices, you may want to change the way that this is set up. So this is 2 pretty simple rules that give us a nice little grid. So let's add that to our code, and then we'll add some more stuff. So I'm going to go to style.css and scroll down a little bit. So now I have div ID choices. The display is grid, and the grid template columns is just 1FR, 1FR. There's a lot more complexity you can go into with this. If you look up CSS grid, this is the website I was talking about before. You're going to see this CSS tricks guide to CSS grid. There's a lot of stuff you can do with this. This is a pretty good overview. You really probably won't need to go into much detail to make a simple website like we're making. But if you're interested, you can look more into it there. Okay, so let's make this a little more interesting. Let's add our images in here, and we're also going to look at a way to lay out our images a little bit better. So right now, the choices, when I go to these choices, we see the image, but we could see an image on this page, and then we could do something else on the next page. So just as an example, let's show our images here. And so I'm going to go back to my index.html, and inside my paragraph, the paragraph is really just a div. It's not really anything different from a div, so you could change that to a div if you want, or leave it as a paragraph. I'm going to go ahead and change it to a div because I'm going to do something fancy with this in a second. So I'm just going to change all these P's to divs, and then I'm going to make some room here for an image. So I'm going to do like that. And then I'm just going to put an image above our anchor tag. So I'm going to put an image, and then the source is images / and then I just have to match the image to where we're going. So this one is dog.jpg. And for this one, it's going to be images / cat.jpg. Uh-oh, what is this pdiv? I think I made a typo. Let's just fix that. Okay, that we don't need. I don't know what happened there. There's some weird typo, but I got rid of it. I'll just click the format button just to make sure everything looks good. Okay, so now we've got our dog and our cat image, but we have a problem, which is that these images don't respect my layout because the images have their own inherent size and they don't really care about the rest of my layout. So how can I fix that? I can set a rule for the image. So I can go in here and I can say div / choices or ID choices. And then this is another thing that I can do. I can put an image after this. So this is called a nested selector. Let me put a little note here. And nested just means it's selecting something that's inside of something else. So this selects IMG tags inside the ID choices div. Because if I have other images, I'm not going to necessarily want to apply the same rule, but I do want to apply this rule to images that are inside of my choices div. So this is called the nested selector. It's very common, and all we do is we just put a space in between the div that we're in and this thing that we want to set a rule for. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the width to these images to be 100%. That means it takes up 100% of whatever space is available. So now when I refresh this, my images sit right next to each other. Okay, because when I go into this image here, there's that rule. So any image that's inside of the choices div has to be with 100%. If that rule goes away, now my image is incised. I could also use pixels here, but by using 100%, it's going to fit that size regardless of what it is. So if I change the size of the container, the images are going to change to reflect that change. So that's a very simple way of just saying I want you to take up the whole space. We might want we might not like that the images are touching, so I could go to my choices and I could just add a gap. So I could say gap is 1em. Add a nice little gap there. Now we've got a little more space. So let's do that. So now we have a nice little gap in our grid, and it'll only add it in between columns, so it doesn't add extra space to the end on either side. Then, if we want to, we could text align center to center our links down here. Although I only applied it to one div. So if I wanted to do that, now I have a problem where I want to apply one rule, but I want to apply it to two divs. So I can't use an ID for that. What I use for that instead is something called a class. So an ID is a name for one thing. A class is a name for a group of things that share similar properties. So there's a lot of examples of this in life. like we're all in a class right now. We all have different names. We all have different identifiers, which could be our ID, but we all share the same property that we, we come to this class every Monday. So if I want to give a div a class, I have these two divs here. I can say class, and I'm going to set this equal to a choice. So the ID is choices, and the class is choice. This might not be the best naming convention because they're could be easy to confuse, but that's okay. So I'm going to give both of these divs the class choice. So now if I go down to my style sheet and I say div dot, so when I'm using classes, a dot signifies the class rather than a hashtag. So I say div dot choice, and then I can say text align is center, and that'll center everything inside of those divs. Okay, so now in my HTML, I have like this. I have my main container section. I have my choices section. And then inside my choices section, I have two choices. I have this choice and this choice. And each choice has an image and a text. I could add more stuff in here if I wanted to, but we have some basic rules that go along with it. So that's a lot of different stuff. CSS is quite complicated. You can see there's a lot of different options, and we really have only barely touched the surface of all sorts of crazy stuff that you can do with CSS. So if you have ideas, if you've seen something on a website that you think looks cool and you want to say, how would I do that? Just try to figure it out. Just Google it. There's a lot of different resources. Of course, you can ask me and we can go over it. I'm really just covering some of the basics just to get you started. But there's a million different things you could do. And it's pretty easy to figure stuff out. Like you might think, oh, this website is kind of boring. Can I add like a really cool gradient to the background? I would just Google CSS gradient. And there's a whole website that's just dedicated to making cool gradients, and it'll generate your code for you. So that's what it looks like. That's kind of cool, I guess. There's the code that makes it. Let's try a different one. Maybe this one will be cool. I kind of like that one, but I don't really want a radial gradient. I would think I want a linear gradient. And I think I want it to be like not 90 degrees, maybe like 45 degrees. Okay, that's pretty cool. And maybe I want a little more pink, so I'll move that guy over there. So I'm not actually writing code or CSS right now. I'm just kind of playing around with this website. But look, it generates this CSS for me. So I can copy this and then go back to my style sheet. And I'm not even going to delete my background color. I'm just going to put this over it. So I'm just going to go here and paste it right there. And so if I decide to get rid of it later, I can always just like bring this back. I don't have to delete it. Whatever comes after the first one is just going to get added on there. And so that looks a lot more interesting, although it does kind of end down here. So how would I fix that? There's probably different ways to fix that. I think if I just say height is 100%, I probably have to do that on both of these things. There we go. Okay, so the reason it doesn't go to the bottom is because my website's content doesn't go to the bottom. But if I just kind of hack the HTML a little bit to say go to 100%, then that'll fix my gradient. I already knew that, so you'll probably have to Google around and figure that out. But all I have to do is just say HTML, comma body, height is 100%, and there we go. Oh, that didn't. Oh, there. Okay, just took a second to update. The pink doesn't really go that well with the text color, but that's okay. I can fix that later. Anyway, you don't have to do a gradient. That's just an example. There's lots and lots of different stuff you can do. So once you have the basic setup and you like the way it looks, you can try to explore, more interesting designs. And if you see something on a website that you think looks cool, just click on it. Like if you're like, ooh, this, this slider looks cool. How did they make this? I can just click on it and go to inspect, and I can see, everything that they did in their CSS. Because this is just a website, so they created this stuff just using CSS as well. So I can see how they did it just by looking at their code here. Okay, I'm going to stop there. You guys can continue to add CSS. You don't necessarily have to have the same layout that I have. It depends on kind of like what you're going for. Maybe you have your choices embedded into the story. Maybe you don't want to use images as much. However you want to go about it is fine. You can just kind of explore that and try adding different stuff. As usual, if you have questions, if you want to go over anything, let me know. I'll come take a look. We have like an hour of workshop time. This assignment is still not due for another couple weeks. So next week, we are going to continue working on this. I forget what we're going to go over next week. What are we going to go over next week? We're going to learn how to publish. Okay. I kind of forgot, but we have other stuff to cover, so I'll remember before next week. But we have another week on web development, and then this assignment will be due. And then we're also going to do some programming, some more real traditional programming with JavaScript after that. So we have a little bit more web stuff that'll come. That'll be kind of related after that. But yeah, for now, just continue working on the Choose Your Own Adventure story and adding styles and layout. And let me know if you have any questions.